You'll walk away with nothing," he said. He had no idea what I had been building for 20 years. I still remember the exact sound of his laugh when he said it. Not loud, not angry, just confident. The kind of confident a man gets when he's already decided he's won something you don't even know you're playing. "You'll walk away with almost nothing," Ethan told me, standing in our kitchen with his car keys in his hand like he had somewhere important to be. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him and thought, you have no idea what you just started. What he didn't know was that for 20 years, while he was busy being the man who handled the money, I had quietly built a financial life he never once bothered to look at. My name is Naomi Ward. I'm 42 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and for 20 years I was married to a man named Ethan Ward. I want to say that clearly right at the start, because this isn't a story about a woman who got lucky in a divorce. This is a story about a man who spent 2 decades assuming he knew exactly who he married and never once asked if he was right. We met when I was 22, fresh out of my MBA program, 6 months away from shipping out to my first duty station. Ethan was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who could walk into a room and somehow make you feel like you were the only interesting person in it. He ran a mid-sized construction company his father had started, and he was proud of it, proud of himself, proud of the life he thought he was building. I loved him. I want that understood too. Whatever came later. Whatever this story becomes, I loved him for a very long time, and some of those years were good ones. We never had children. That was a quiet grief between us that we learned to live around rather than through. And somewhere in the middle of those 20 years, without either of us naming it out loud, we settled into roles. Ethan handled the money. That was the phrase he used over and over, like a title he'd given himself. I handle the money, Naomi. You handle the army. I let him believe that. Not because I was foolish, but because I had my own accounts, my own investments, my own plans. And I never saw the need to compete with him for a title he seemed to need so badly. The change started small enough that I almost missed it. A few months ago, Ethan started keeping his phone face down on every surface, something he'd never done before. He changed his passcode and didn't tell me the new one, which he also had never done. He started coming home later, always with a reasonable excuse, a supplier meeting a site inspection traffic on the interstate. And he started smiling at his phone in a way that had nothing to do with anything happening in our kitchen. I noticed the way people notice weather changing. A shift in the air before you can name what's coming. I'm not a suspicious person by nature. 20 years in the Army teaches you to trust the people beside you because you have to. But it also teaches you to read a room, to notice when something doesn't add up, and something about Ethan's rhythm had stopped adding up. There was one evening I won't forget. I came downstairs for water around 11, and Ethan was on the back porch, phone pressed to his ear, voice low, in a way he probably thought I couldn't hear through the screen door. Just wait another couple weeks, he said, and then he laughed soft and warm in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I didn't confront him. I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't check his phone while he slept or follow his truck to job sites. That's not who I am, and honestly, it's not who the Army trained me to be. In my career, when something feels wrong, you don't panic and you don't accuse. You gather information. You confirm what's real before you act on what you feel. So that's exactly what I did. I started quietly, methodically going back through our financial records. Not to catch him, not yet, not consciously. I told myself I was just being responsible the way I always had been, but somewhere underneath that explanation was a colder, clearer thought I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. If this marriage is ending, I need to know exactly where I stand. What I found in those first few nights at the kitchen table, going through statements with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, wasn't dramatic. There were no hidden accounts, no obvious affair receipts, nothing a daytime television plot would want. What I found was smaller and in its own way more unsettling gaps. Purchases I didn't recognize. A pattern of spending that didn't match the man who used to lecture me about being careful with every dollar. I sat there that night, the house quiet around me. Ethan's truck not yet in the driveway, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was clarity. 20 years of marriage, and for the first time I understood that I might be about to find out exactly who my husband really was, and exactly how little he had ever bothered to learn about me. I've spent 20 years learning that panic is a luxury you can't afford when the mission actually matters. That lesson didn't stay in uniform. It came home with me. So once I really understood that my marriage might be ending, I didn't cry in the bathroom or call my sister at midnight. I made appointments. The first was with a CPA named Diane Foster, a woman my finance officer had recommended years earlier when I first started thinking seriously about retirement planning. I sat across from her in a small office that smelled like coffee and printer toner, and I laid out as calmly as I could exactly what I needed. I think my marriage is ending, I told her. I need to know exactly what I own, what's mine, what's separate, and what's documented. Diane didn't ask me why. She just nodded and started pulling up spreadsheets. That afternoon sitting in that office, I started to understand something about myself that I'd never fully articulated even in my own head. For 20 years, while Ethan believed he was the one handling the money, I had been quietly building something entirely separate. Not out of distrust exactly, out of habit, out of the discipline the Army beats into you whether you ask for it or not. Always have a contingency, always know your position. Never assume the ground under you is stable just because it feels that way. My military pension, my thrift savings plan, which I had contributed to the maximum allowable amount nearly every year since my second deployment. A Roth IRA I opened at 26 on the advice of a finance officer who told me, half-joking, "The Army will forget you exist the day you retire, so make sure your money doesn't." A modest but steadily growing portfolio of index funds I'd built slowly reinvesting dividends, instead of spending them the kind of unglamorous, unremarkable discipline that never makes headlines but quietly compounds into something real over 2 decades. And underneath all of it, a piece of property I'd inherited from my Aunt Carol 6 years into our marriage, a small lake house that had sat mostly untouched, appreciating in value that Ethan had always dismissed as your little project whenever it came up. None of it was hidden. That's the part I need people to understand clearly. Every account had my name on it in some cases, both our names filed exactly the way the law required, taxed exactly the way it should have been. Ethan didn't know the details, not because I'd concealed them, but because he had simply never asked. He assumed. He assumed his construction company was the engine of our household, that his income was the real income, and that whatever I brought home from the Army was, in his words once at a dinner party that I never fully forgave, nice but not real money. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reyes, said something to me in our first meeting that I've thought about many times since. "Do not hide anything," she told me, looking at me directly over her reading glasses. "Not $1. Everything gets disclosed fully transparently. That's not just the law, Naomi. That's how you win the right way." I remember answering her without hesitation. "I won't," I said. "I don't need to hide anything. I need him to finally see it." So that's what the next several weeks became. Not scheming, not manipulation, just preparation, the kind I'd been trained for my entire adult life. I updated every account statement. I had the lake house formally appraised. I organized 20 years of tax returns, contribution records, and investment statements into folders so thorough that Patricia actually laughed when she saw them. "You could teach a class on this," she said. I told her I'd had a lot of practice preparing for inspections that could end careers if you got the paperwork wrong. This didn't feel so different. There was a strange, quiet loneliness to those weeks. I'd sit at the dining table at night organizing decades of financial history, while Ethan was out, presumably with her, whoever she was, and I never once felt the urge to confront him with what I suspected. Partly because I still didn't have proof of the affair itself, only the shape of one. But mostly because I understood something Patricia had helped me see clearly. The truth was going to come out on its own, in a room built for exactly that purpose, and when it did, I needed to be the only person in that room who wasn't surprised by it. I remember one evening in particular. Ethan came home late, humming under his breath, looser and happier than I'd seen him in months. He kissed the top of my head on his way to the refrigerator, a small, careless gesture that used to mean something, and now felt like something else entirely. I watched him from the kitchen table folders spread out in front of me that he didn't even glance at, and I felt something settle inside me that was almost peaceful. I knew without a single word being said that he was preparing to file, and for the first time since this whole quiet unraveling began, I wasn't afraid of what came next. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Ethan handed me an envelope across the kitchen counter, like he was passing me a bill for something I'd ordered. I remember the weight of it in my hand, thicker than a regular piece of mail, the return address printed in a font that looked deliberately official. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. I could see it in his face, that particular kind of ease men get when they believe they've already won an argument nobody's had yet. "I think you know what that is," he said. His voice wasn't cruel. That's what I remember most clearly. It was almost gentle, almost kind, the way you'd speak to someone you felt sorry for. He'd clearly rehearsed this moment, maybe more than once, maybe in front of a mirror, maybe with her. "I'm filing for divorce, Naomi. I think it's better for both of us." I opened the envelope slowly, standing there in the kitchen where I'd made him breakfast 1,000 mornings before that one. The papers were exactly what I expected. Irreconcilable differences. A request for equitable distribution. His attorney's name printed neatly at the bottom, someone named Gregory Halston, a name I recognized from local business circles, the kind of divorce lawyer who advertised on the sides of city buses. Ethan stood there watching me read, arms crossed, and when I looked up at him, he had the audacity to smile. "I want you to know," he said, "I'm not trying to be unfair. But you should probably talk to a lawyer because honestly, Naomi, you'll walk away with almost nothing. Most of what we have I built. The company, the house, the investments, that's all me. You've been in the Army your whole adult life. Everyone knows what that pays." I set the papers down on the counter very carefully, the way you'd set down something you didn't want to break, even though nothing in my hands was fragile at all. "Is that what you believe?" I asked him. Not sharp, not defensive, just genuinely curious, the way you'd ask someone if they really thought the weather was going to hold. He laughed, an actual laugh, short and confident, like I'd said something almost sweet in its naivety. "I know it," he said. "I've talked to Gregory. I know exactly how this works. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. I didn't feel devastated. 20 years of marriage ending over a kitchen counter should have broken something in me, and maybe some part of it did quietly somewhere I'd deal with later. But mostly what I felt was a strange, cold clarity, the same feeling I used to get before a difficult briefing when you know the room is about to learn something they aren't prepared for. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said quietly, not a threat. Just a fact laid down as plainly as the papers between us. He laughed again, softer this time, almost affectionate, like I was a child saying something dramatic. "Naomi, come on, I'm not trying to fight with you. I just think it's time we're both honest about how things actually are." I signed the papers 3 days later in Patricia's office with the kind of steady hand that surprised even me. Patricia watched me sign and said almost gently, "You don't have to rush this." I told her I wasn't rushing. I was just done pretending there was anything left to save. Word spread through Ethan's family faster than I expected. His mother, Carol Ward, no relation to my late aunt, just an unfortunate coincidence of names, called me exactly once, ostensibly to check on me, though the real purpose became clear within the first 2 minutes. "You know, Naomi, military pay isn't what people think it is," she said, her voice dripping with a sympathy that felt more like condescension. "Ethan's worked so hard to build what you two have. I just hope you're being realistic about your expectations." His sister Melissa was less subtle. At a family gathering I attended out of obligation more than desire, she pulled me aside near the dessert table and said with what she probably thought was kindness, "For what it's worth, I don't think you should feel bad. Nobody expects you to walk away with much. You've given the Army your whole life. That's admirable, Naomi. Really." The pity in her voice was almost its own kind of insult. I smiled at all of them. I thanked Carol for her concern. I told Melissa I appreciated her honesty. I didn't correct a single one of them, didn't offer a single number, didn't defend myself against assumptions I knew with absolute certainty were about to be dismantled in a courtroom none of them had bothered to prepare for. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. Ethan spent those weeks in visibly good spirits, humming in the kitchen, meeting with Gregory Halston twice a week, once even joking to me that I should get a good lawyer just to make it look fair. I told him I already had one. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she'd found. He simply assumed the way he'd assumed for 20 years that he already understood the whole picture. I spent those same 6 weeks in Patricia's office going over documentation until it was airtight, watching the calendar count down toward a day I was, for the first time in this entire ordeal, actually looking forward to. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, all dark wood and fluorescent light, the kind of room that manages to feel both formal and faded at the same time. I sat beside Patricia at one table. Ethan sat beside Gregory Halston at the other, close enough that I could see the confident set of his shoulders the way he kept glancing back at his mother and sister in the gallery, like a man checking that his audience was paying attention. Gregory opened with a version of our marriage I almost didn't recognize. He described Ethan as the driving financial force of the household, the man who had built a construction company from nothing, who had provided the home, the vehicles, the lifestyle. He described me without ever quite saying it directly as someone who had, in his words, contributed steady but modest income throughout the marriage, while Mr. Ward carried the primary financial burden of building their shared assets. Then he said something that made Patricia's pen still against her legal pad for just a second. "Mrs. Ward," he said, gesturing toward me without quite looking at me, "has, for the most part, been along for the ride financially. This isn't a criticism. Military service is admirable. But equitable distribution should reflect who actually built what exists to distribute." I felt Patricia's hand rest briefly on the table beside mine, a small, steady gesture that meant not yet. The judge, a woman named Judge Alvarez with sharp reading glasses, and an expression that gave away nothing, cut through the opening statements fairly quickly. "I'll need full financial disclosure from both parties," she said. "Every account, every asset, every liability documented and verified. I don't make decisions based on assumptions in this courtroom." That was our moment. Patricia walked to the clerk's table and set down a binder so thick it made an audible sound against the wood. Gregory's eyebrows rose slightly. Ethan actually leaned forward in his seat, and for the first time since he'd handed me those papers across our kitchen counter, I saw something flicker across his face that wasn't confidence. Diane Foster took the stand as our financial witness, and I watched 20 years of quiet, disciplined effort become for the first time visible to the one person who had never bothered to look at it. She walked the court through my military pension vested and protected under federal law. She walked through my TSP contributions dating back to my second year of active duty, showing the steady, unbroken pattern of maximum contributions year after year. She showed the Roth IRA, opened when I was 26, untouched, growing quietly in the background of a marriage where my husband believed he alone was building something. Then she got to the investment portfolio. Index funds purchased consistently, dividends reinvested, rather than spent, a habit so unremarkable on any single month statement that it would have meant nothing to anyone glancing at it casually, and yet compounded across nearly 2 decades, it had become something substantial, something real, something Ethan had walked past in our own home office 100 times, without ever once asking what it was. And then the lake house. Diane explained calmly and without embellishment that the property had been inherited from my Aunt Carol 6 years into the marriage, appraised, documented, held separately in my name, exactly as the law allowed, and had appreciated significantly in the years since. I watched Ethan's face throughout all of this. At first it was skepticism, a slight dismissive tilt of his head like he expected this to be some kind of exaggeration his lawyer would easily dismantle. But as Diane kept going, kept producing documents, kept answering Gregory's increasingly sharp cross-examination with calm, unshaken clarity, I watched that skepticism curdle into something else. Confusion first, then something closer to disbelief. Gregory tried twice to suggest that some of these funds might have been commingled with marital assets in ways that would make them subject to different treatment. Both times, Diane produced documentation showing clean, unbroken separation contribution histories, account statements, tax filings, all of it consistent, all of it exactly where it needed to be. Judge Alvarez asked Ethan directly at one point whether he had ever reviewed his wife's TSP or investment statements during the marriage. Ethan hesitated, glanced toward Gregory, then answered honestly, which I respected him for even in that moment. "No, Your Honor, I didn't feel the need to. I assumed I had a general sense of our finances." "You assumed," Judge Alvarez repeated, not unkindly, but with the particular weight of a woman who had heard that word used as an excuse many times before. I sat perfectly still through all of it, hands folded in my lap, the way I'd learned to sit through difficult briefings years ago, giving nothing away. But inside, something was settling into place with each new document Diane presented. Not triumph. Exactly, not yet. Something quieter. The simple, undeniable satisfaction of watching the truth finally take up the space it had always deserved. By the time the morning session ended, the confident set of Ethan's shoulders had disappeared entirely. His mother and sister sat very still in the gallery, no longer whispering to each other, and Ethan himself, for the first time in 20 years, was looking at me like he was seeing someone he had never actually met. The afternoon session felt different from the moment we walked back into that courtroom. Something had shifted overnight in the air between the two tables, though nothing had technically changed. Gregory Halston was still composed, still professional, but there was a new tightness around his eyes, the look of a man recalculating a strategy he'd been confident in only hours earlier. Diane returned to the stand, and this time Patricia led her through the second half of the picture. Not just what I had built, but how carefully and how consistently over such a long stretch of time. Diane explained that in 20 years I had never once withdrawn early from my TSP or my Roth IRA, never once liquidated an investment for a vacation or a car, or anything that wasn't itself another investment. Lieutenant Colonel Ward's financial pattern, she said, shows one of the most disciplined long-term accumulation strategies I've reviewed in 23 years of practice. Every contribution reinvested, every dollar accounted for, no irregularities of any kind. I watched several jurors' worth of expression cross Judge Alvarez's face, even though there was no jury, just her taking careful notes, occasionally removing her glasses to look directly at whoever was speaking. Then Patricia shifted the testimony gently but deliberately toward Ethan's financial record over the same period, and this was where the room's temperature really began to change. Diane walked through documented expenditures from the joint accounts, and from the business a boat purchased 18 months earlier, financed in a way that suggested it hadn't been fully disclosed to me at the time, a recreational vehicle. Business expense reports that, on closer inspection, included charges from restaurants and hotels that didn't correspond to any client meetings Diane could find records of. Gregory objected repeatedly, and Judge Alvarez sustained some of those objections, particularly around anything that veered too close to alleging the affair directly, rather than simply establishing the financial pattern. But documents don't need accusations attached to them to speak clearly. A charge at a hotel 40 minutes from any job site on a Tuesday afternoon, repeated on a near-monthly basis for over a year, tells its own quiet story without anyone needing to say a single word about what it means. I didn't look at Ethan much during this part. I didn't need the satisfaction of watching his face, and honestly, some small part of me still didn't want to see him humiliated even now. I kept my eyes mostly on Diane, on Patricia, on the steady rhythm of documents being entered and explained one after another, until the picture in front of Judge Alvarez looked nothing like the one Gregory had painted that morning. At one point, Judge Alvarez turned directly to Ethan and asked him a question that I think more than anything else that day cracked something open in him. "Mr. Ward, were you aware of your wife's full financial holdings prior to filing for divorce?" There was a long pause, long enough that Gregory shifted slightly in his seat as if he wanted to answer for his client but knew he couldn't. "No, Your Honor," Ethan finally said. His voice had lost the polish it carried that morning. I thought I understood our situation. I didn't realize the extent of it." "You didn't ask," Judge Alvarez said. Not a question this time. A statement delivered plainly, the kind of sentence that lands harder for its lack of drama. Ethan didn't answer that one at all. I watched his mother in the gallery during this stretch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her earlier confidence completely drained from her posture. Melissa sat beside her, staring down at her phone screen, though it was clearly off, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room, including her brother. By late afternoon, Gregory attempted one final maneuver, suggesting that some portion of the investment growth during the marriage should be considered a marital asset, regardless of whose name was on the account, given that we had filed joint tax returns for most of those years. Patricia handled this calmly, citing the specific separate property statutes that applied, walking Judge Alvarez through case law precedent, with the same unhurried thoroughness Diane had used for the financial records. Judge Alvarez took notes, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then moved the proceedings toward closing arguments to be heard the following morning. As the session ended and people began gathering their things, I caught Ethan's eye across the room just for a moment. He wasn't smiling anymore. He hadn't been smiling for hours, actually, but this was different. This was the first time all day he looked directly at me, not at Gregory, not at his mother, not at the documents in front of him. Just at me. And what I saw in his face wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief. The particular grief of realizing you've spent 2 decades standing next to something valuable and never once thought to look at it closely. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courtroom that evening. I felt something quieter, and in its own way heavier. The strange, unglamorous relief of finally being seen accurately, even if it had taken a judge and a stack of financial records to make it happen. Closing arguments began the next morning, under a gray sky that pressed against the courtroom windows, the kind of light that makes everything inside feel a little more serious than it might on a sunnier day. I sat beside Patricia, hands folded, watching Gregory Halston stand to deliver what I suspected even before he began would be a much more careful speech than the one he'd opened with 2 days earlier. He didn't repeat his claim that I had been along for the ride. I noticed that immediately. Instead, he shifted his entire framing, arguing, now that regardless of how the assets had accumulated, fairness required the court to consider the full context of the marriage, the years, the partnership, the assumption of shared life that both parties had, in his words, reasonably relied upon. It was a more sophisticated argument than his first one, and I respected the pivot, even knowing where it was ultimately headed. Patricia rose when it was her turn, and her closing was different from anything I'd expected. She didn't attack Ethan. She didn't dwell on the boat, the hotel charges, the pattern Diane had laid out the day before. Instead, she simply calmly walked Judge Alvarez back through the story the documents themselves told. Naomi Ward did not hide anything from this marriage, she said. Every account bears her name disclosed fully exactly as the law requires. What Mr. Ward didn't know about his wife's finances isn't evidence of concealment. It's evidence that he never asked. There's a meaningful difference, Your Honor, between a spouse who hides the truth and a spouse whose truth simply was never sought out. She continued, methodical and unhurried, walking through each category the court needed to weigh separate property versus marital property, the pension protections under federal law, the clean documentation of the inheritance, the investment portfolio's clear unbroken history, predating and continuing steadily through the marriage. This court doesn't need to punish Mr. Ward, she said. It simply needs to apply the law to the facts as they actually exist, rather than as either party assumed them to be. Judge Alvarez recessed for deliberation just before noon, and those 2 hours waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom were strangely harder than anything that had happened inside it. Ethan sat on a bench near the far wall with Gregory, his mother, and sister a few feet away, none of them speaking much. I sat with Patricia near a vending machine that hummed too loudly, and for a while neither of us said anything either. At one point, Ethan looked over at me. I didn't look away this time. There was something almost naked in his expression, stripped of the confidence he'd carried into that courtroom 2 days earlier. He didn't come over. He didn't say anything. He just looked for a long moment, like a man trying to recalculate 20 years of memory in real time, trying to understand how he had missed something this large while living beside it every single day. When we were called back and Judge Alvarez didn't waste time with preamble, she stated plainly that the court had reviewed all submitted financial documentation and found it on Naomi Ward's side to be thorough, transparent, and fully compliant with disclosure requirements. She noted without editorializing that Mr. Ward's own financial conduct during the marriage, undisclosed purchases, unexplained expenditures would be weighed accordingly in the final distribution. Then she read through the numbers. The pension protected and calculated according to federal formula. The TSP and Roth IRA confirmed as separate property, given their documented contribution histories predating and independent of marital commingling. The investment portfolio confirmed the same way. The lake house confirmed as inherited separate property, its appreciated value remaining entirely mine. I watched Ethan's face as the final figures were read aloud, and I watched something in him quietly, visibly collapse. Not dramatically, not with tears or outbursts. Just a slow, sinking recognition settling into his shoulders, into the set of his jaw, into the way his hands, which had been resting confidently on the table 2 days earlier, now sat still and open in his lap, like he didn't quite know what to do with them anymore. He had walked into that courtroom certain he was the wealthier one, certain that 20 years of marriage had been carried primarily on his back, certain that I would walk away with, in his own words, almost nothing. Instead, he was hearing in real time in front of his mother and sister, and a judge who had no interest in anyone's assumptions that the wealthiest person in that marriage had been sitting quietly beside him the entire time filing paperwork he never once thought to read. I didn't feel joy watching this unfold. I want to be honest about that. I felt something quieter and more complicated, the strange, sober weight of watching a man you once loved discover too late that he had spent 2 decades standing next to something valuable and calling it nothing simply because he had never bothered to look closely enough to see what it actually was. The final ruling came down 2 weeks later, delivered in a shorter session than either of us expected. Judge Alvarez read through the formal order in the same measured, unemotional tone she'd used throughout the entire proceeding, as if she were reading a weather report rather than the ending of a marriage. There was no drama in her voice, no sense of vindication or judgment. Just the plain application of law to facts, exactly as Patricia had promised me it would be from the very beginning. I kept the pension calculated and protected under federal statute. I kept the TSP, the Roth IRA, the investment portfolio built one quiet reinvested dividend at a time. I kept the lake house appraised and confirmed as separate property, the same lake house Ethan used to refer to almost affectionately as your little project, never once asking what it might actually be worth. The marital home was to be sold, proceeds split according to the formula the court determined fair, accounting for both parties' documented contributions, and notably for the undisclosed expenditures Diane had traced back through Ethan's business and personal accounts. Ethan did not get what he came into that courtroom expecting. He did not walk away believing, as he had for 20 years, that he was the one who had built everything worth having. And I think in the end that reckoning cost him more than any number on any piece of paper ever could. We walked out of the courthouse separately, though we ended up near the same bank of elevators, an awkward, unavoidable proximity that neither of us had planned for. He looked at me while we waited, and for a moment I thought he might say something angry, something bitter, the kind of last word men sometimes reach for when they've lost more than they expected to lose. Instead, what he said was quieter than that. "I really didn't know," he said. "About any of it. The accounts, the property, all of it. I want you to know I wasn't lying about that." "I know," I told him, and I meant it. "You never asked." He was quiet for a moment, looking down at the tile floor between us. "I thought I knew what you were worth," he finally said, "because I thought I knew what was in your bank account." I paused before I answered, choosing the words carefully, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted him to actually hear them. "You were wrong about both," I said. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in without him. That was, as it turned out, the last real conversation we ever had. In the months that followed, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in a very long time, which was simply slow down. I took an extended leave, the kind I'd postponed for years, because there was always another deployment, another assignment, another reason to keep moving forward instead of sitting still with my own life. I drove out to the lake house, the one Ethan had dismissed for 6 years as unimportant, and I spent an entire month there, repainting the porch railing myself, learning the names of the birds that came to the feeder outside the kitchen window, sitting on the dock some evenings, until the sky went completely dark, listening to water lap quietly against the shore. I didn't buy anything new to prove a point. I didn't post triumphant photos or make a show of the life I was building. I simply started living it quietly, the same way I'd built the foundation of it all those years without anyone watching. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from being finally fully seen, not because you demanded it, but because the truth simply had nowhere left to hide. I think about that morning in the kitchen sometimes, the one where Ethan handed me those papers with such certainty, so convinced he already knew how the story would end. I think about how many marriages, how many lives run on assumptions like that, one person deciding they understand the whole picture without ever once asking to see it clearly. Ethan wasn't a monster. I want to be fair about that even now. He was simply a man who mistook confidence for knowledge, and by the time he realized the difference, the courtroom had already made the correction for him. I'm building something new now, slower, quieter, entirely my own. Not out of spite, not as revenge, but because for the first time in 20 years, I get to decide what my life actually looks like without anyone assuming they already know the answer. The day my husband filed for divorce, he believed he was ending my future. In reality, he was only walking away from a life he never bothered to understand. If this story moved you, I'd love to know what part stayed with you the longest. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story? Tell me in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. We have new stories like this one waiting for you every day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe now. Let's keep walking through these stories together, one truth at a time.